happens when a single sentence in a book can destroy a man's life? When a footnote becomes a federal investigation and a classroom becomes the front line of America's newest war? The storm began at Rutgers University, New Jersey, when a petition from Charlie Kirk's Turning Point USA ignited a political firestorm. Their target, Professor Mark Bray, author of Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook. One sentence in his work mentioned donating a portion of royalties to anti-fascist defense funds. Within hours, right-wing outlets branded him Dr. Antifa. Hashtags like Fire Drantifa and Defund Rutgers swept across X. By sunset, the threats arrived. Photos of Bray's home leaked online. Death threats flooded his inbox. Students whispered that FBI agents were sitting in his lectures. The university tried to defend academic freedom and instantly became a national villain. In the eyes of millions, Mark Bray wasn't a scholar anymore. He was America's most dangerous professor. What followed revealed how fragile the boundary between free thought and national security had become. President Trump had just labeled Antifa a terrorist organization, blaming it for attacks on ICE agents and federal buildings. Conservative networks seized the moment, painting every anti-fascist writer as a possible accomplice to terrorism. Inside the White House, officials described it as a domestic containment strategy. Outside, it felt like a witch hunt in digital form. The escalation mirrored global patterns. In Russia, critics of the Kremlin had been branded foreign agents. In Iran, scholars questioning state policy vanished overnight. Even in China, academics who spoke of democracy faced silent erasure. America now stood on that same precipice, the world's self-proclaimed beacon of liberty, policing ideas with the zeal of its adversaries. As fear spread through campuses, the message was unmistakable. Supporting protest was now subversion. Students who once debated policy began deleting posts. Professors edited syllabi, and journalists covered rallies from a distance. Across the nation, a chill descended, one that felt less like order and more like obedience. How far can a democracy go to protect itself before it becomes the thing it fears? And when words themselves are treated as weapons, who will decide which ones are safe to speak? It began like a whisper, then exploded into gunfire. On July 4th, while fireworks painted the Texas night sky, masked figures dressed in black stormed the Prairieland ICE detention center in Alvarado. Within minutes, the air filled with gunfire smoke and the metallic echo of chaos. A police officer was shot in the neck. Another assailant fired dozens of rounds at unarmed guards. The attackers vanished into the darkness. By dawn, the Department of Justice had declared it an act of terrorism. 10 suspects identified as Antifa affiliates were charged with attempted murder. President Trump responded from the Oval Office, calling it a coordinated assault on American sovereignty. Within hours, the administration launched Operation Midway Blitz, a sweeping federal offensive described as a counterterrorism mission, but executed like a manhunt. The FBI, DHS, and ICE combined forces. Black vans roamed the streets of Portland, Chicago, Austin. Helicopters hovered over protest zones. Footage of agents storming apartments at dawn flooded social media. Over 600 people were arrested, activists, journalists, even professors. For many, the message was unmistakable dissent had been reclassified as domestic terror. The numbers told their own story. Homeland Security reported assaults on ICE and Border Patrol agents up by 700%. Independent analysts disputed the figure, but none denied the surge in violence. Antifa, once a fringe protest movement, had become the perfect villain, a faceless enemy linking every riot, data leak, or street clash. For Trump's America, it was the ultimate symbol of chaos and justification for control. Strategically, the move resembled tactics long used in global hotspots. Russia's crackdown on color revolutions, Iran's suppression of reformist groups under the banner of national defense. Even China's security campaigns in Hong Kong all invoked the same formula: stability first, freedom later. The United States, once the critic of these measures, was now borrowing from their playbook. Defense news analysts compared Midway Blitz to counter-cartel operations, blending intelligence, surveillance, digital tracking, and kinetic raids. Jane's Defense Weekly noted the use of advanced drones and AI-assisted crowd monitoring technologies once reserved for foreign battlefields now deployed in US cities. The cost was more than political. Communities fractured, activists vanished, families watched live feeds of their loved ones being dragged away. Federal agents defended the operation as necessary. Civil rights groups called it authoritarian theater. The truth lay somewhere in between, a state balancing on the knife's edge between order and oppression. As cities trembled, the question grew louder: if this is what democracy's defense looks like, what would tyranny even need to change? Chicago, dawn. The sound of a bullhorn shattered the quiet outside the Broadview ICE facility. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered students, activists, teachers, chanting against federal raids. Among them stood Professor Elias Zepeda, a respected English lecturer known for his community work and immigrant rights advocacy. Hours later, he was in handcuffs, branded a terrorist. Federal officials claimed Zepeda had arrived armed and ready to attack. Homeland Security briefings accused him of plotting an assault on ICE agents. Within hours, his photo dominated cable news, a supposed professor turned extremist. But within days, the narrative began to unravel. Witnesses said he had been documenting the protest, not leading it. His concealed firearm permit was legal, his demeanor calm, no shots fired, no threats made. Yet his name was now forever tied to the word terrorism. For Trump's administration, Zepeda's arrest symbolized strength proof that Operation Midway Blitz was cutting into Antifa's so-called academic networks. Attorney General Pam Bondi compared the crackdown to dismantling cartels brick by brick, network by network. But civil liberty advocates warned of a darker precedent, a government targeting ideas instead of crimes. Across the Atlantic, observers from BBC and DW drew chilling parallels. In Moscow, journalists accused of extremism had vanished. In Tehran, professors faced the gallows for dissent. And in Beijing, academic surveillance had become institutionalized facial recognition in classrooms, loyalty tests disguised as security checks. America's actions, they argued, blurred the very line it once defended. Yet the domestic mood was split. Supporters of the administration praised the raids as overdue justice, pointing to rising assaults on law enforcement. Critics, however, saw a silent coup against the Constitution, the slow erosion of free speech under the banner of counterterrorism. Reuters reported an unprecedented surge in academic resignations. Universities quietly suspended lectures on fascism, protest movements, and political resistance. Faculty feared association, not ideology. A professor teaching about civil disobedience could suddenly find agents in the back row. Defense analysts warned of a strategic cost as well. Suppressing intellectual discourse at home, they argued weakened America's soft power abroad. At a time when Washington was confronting Beijing over human rights and Moscow over censorship, the moral high ground was slipping. Zepeda's story became a national mirror, reflecting a country unsure whether it was fighting radicals or becoming radical itself. His students described him not as a threat, but as a mentor who taught them to question authority with words, not weapons. He taught us that silence is complicity, one said. But now silence was survival. As fear replaced debate, America's campuses, once the engines of democracy, began to resemble occupied zones. And amid the growing uncertainty, one haunting question echoed: when education itself becomes subversion, what future can freedom have? Newark Liberty International Airport, Terminal C, the announcement board flickered, once then went dark, and with it the future of a man who had already lost his country. Mark Bray stood with his wife and 2 children, passports in hand, waiting to board a flight to Madrid. He had made the decision no scholar should ever face to flee his homeland. Hours earlier, FBI agents had called his department chair at Rutgers, demanding full cooperation in an ongoing counterterrorism review. His address was already public. Threats had doubled. The family had packed in silence. But at the gate, something strange happened. Their reservation vanished. No record, no seats, no explanation. Just an error message that felt deliberate. Bray looked around, men in plain clothes, earpieces glinting. He knew then the surveillance wasn't paranoia anymore. The second attempt came the next morning. Before boarding, federal officers stopped him again, interrogating him in front of his terrified children. The questions were vague, but the intent was clear. His name was now a red flag in the federal database. To some in Washington, he was not an academic, but a threat. Hours later, the plane lifted into the blue Atlantic sky. Freedom didn't feel like victory. It felt like exile. In Spain, Bray's ordeal became an international headline. Reuters called it the academic exile of America's Antifa professor. The Guardian described it as a test of the First Amendment under pressure. DW noted how the world's loudest democracy had fallen silent around one of its own thinkers. From his small apartment in Madrid, Bray finally spoke not as a fugitive, but as a warning. Antifa is not an organization, he explained in interviews. It's an idea, a stance against fascism. But his words, clipped and twisted, reappeared across US media as defending terrorism. The White House doubled down. Trump, in a televised address, declared Antifa a domestic cancer, vowing to root it out from our cities and our schools. Attorney General Bondi compared its ideology to ISIS. For the administration, this was a fight for control, not just of streets, but of the narrative itself. The scene drew uncomfortable comparisons abroad. In Russia, dissidents faced similar digital smears before arrest. In Iran, exile was the price of dissent. Now an American professor joined their ranks. But the story went deeper. Defense News revealed that ICE and FBI joint cyber units had used predictive algorithms to flag potential extremist sympathizers, many of them academics who had written critically about state power. The line between counterintelligence and censorship was dissolving. By late 2025, over a dozen US scholars had left the country citing harassment, surveillance, or visa freezes. Some found refuge in Canada, others in Europe. They called themselves the silent faculty. And as Bray looked back at a nation still tearing itself apart, one thought lingered: had America's war on extremism become a war on thought itself? The war had left the streets and entered the classrooms. Across the United States University, administrators received quiet but unmistakable visits. Agents from the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI presented formal requests for academic cooperation, faculty lists, lecture recordings, reading syllabi that included terms like resistance fascism or civil unrest. What began as counterterrorism intelligence now looked like intellectual profiling. Rutgers, Berkeley, Chicago, and NYU, the very campuses that once defined America's free inquiry, were now under silent review. In televised briefings, Trump's allies accused woke institutions of radicalizing youth. They're training anarchists on taxpayer dollars, warned one senator on Fox News. And in the background, a new wave of investigations had already begun. At Rutgers, students who had defended Mark Bray were questioned by ICE agents. At UCLA, professors who taught protest theory found their course funding suspended. At the University of Chicago, faculty were instructed to report potentially subversive speech. Overnight, American academia began to resemble a Cold War archive. Reuters documented how dozens of faculty members resigned rather than submit lecture material to federal authorities. DW compared the atmosphere to the German McCarthy era when suspicion became policy. This is not security, wrote The Guardian, it's surveillance disguised as patriotism. Yet within Trump's administration, the message was clear: universities were the new battlefield. The strategic doctrine was simple: win the cultural war by controlling its source. ICE analysts described professors as influence nodes, their teachings potentially capable of mobilizing radical sentiment. Defense News reported that advanced AI monitoring systems originally designed to track cartel communications had been repurposed to scan social media activity among faculty and students. Jane's Defense Weekly described it bluntly: academic surveillance has gone domestic. Meanwhile, a new kind of resistance emerged. Secret student collectives used encrypted channels to share banned readings and livestream lectures from exiled professors. But the cost was high disciplinary hearings, deportations, even the loss of scholarships. The chaos wasn't confined to the US allies abroad, watched nervously. Britain's BBC reported concerns from Oxford scholars warning that America's academic repression undermines its credibility as a defender of liberal democracy. In Berlin, DW commentators recalled East Germany's Stasi years, a tragic echo in a nation that once promised never to repeat it. Inside the United States, fear had become routine. Professors deleted their online archives. Students avoided political debates. The silence on campuses was louder than any protest. But beneath that silence simmered anger. The same generation that had grown up watching riots, pandemics, and political purges now saw their universities turn into outposts of federal control. For them, this wasn't patriotism, it was paralysis. And so the question loomed: when the government decides what can be taught, does knowledge still belong to the people or to power? Toronto. The first snowfall of November blanketed the campus of the Munk School of Global Affairs, now home to three of America's most prominent exiles: Timothy Snyder, Jason Stanley, and Marcy Shore. The trio, once pillars of Yale's intellectual elite, had fled south of the border to escape what they called an authoritarian chill creeping through US academia. Their departure symbolized something far larger than a personal choice. It marked the collapse of an unspoken covenant that American universities were sanctuaries of free thought. Snyder, author of On Tyranny, said it plainly: when historians are afraid to teach history, democracy is already in crisis. By late 2025, more than 50 professors across the US had resigned or relocated abroad. Canada, Germany, and the Netherlands became their new havens. The Guardian described it as the largest intellectual flight from the US since the Vietnam era. DW called it a purge without prisons. Meanwhile, the White House celebrated what it framed as a victory against subversion. Trump declared that American campuses are no longer safe harbors for radicals. ICE and FBI task forces released statistics boasting 900 arrests linked to Antifa-affiliated networks. Yet independent reviews from Reuters and Al Jazeera found that many of those detained had never attended a single protest. Some were librarians, journalists, or social workers victims of guilt by algorithm. The US-China propaganda war intensified. Beijing's state media seized on the moment, accusing Washington of hypocrisy. America jails its thinkers while preaching freedom abroad. Russian outlets echoed the same tone, calling it the fall of the American mind. What began as a domestic crackdown was now eroding global confidence in US soft power, a critical pillar of its strategic prestige. Defense News warned that while the US was winning battles against extremist threats, it was losing the war for moral legitimacy. Jane's Defense Weekly drew an even starker parallel, comparing the operation's logic to counterinsurgency tactics once used in Afghanistan: identify, isolate, neutralize, applied now not to militants but to intellectuals. Inside the country, polarization deepened. Conservative networks hailed the exodus as cleansing the nation's moral rot. Liberals mourned it as an ideological exile. Between those extremes stood a quiet majority, confused, fearful, and numb. Universities once teeming with debate now echoed with restraint. Students recorded lectures not for notes, but for protection. And in Madrid, Mark Bray watched the headlines unfold his exile, now both symbol and warning. His children spoke Spanish more easily than English. His name remained radioactive in American academia, yet his words lingered in the global conversation. Fascism doesn't always come with soldiers. Sometimes it arrives with paperwork. What began as an investigation into extremism had become a mirror held up to a divided nation, one forced to choose between control and conscience, security and soul. So the question remains, when freedom's defenders become its executioners, who will defend freedom then? In 2025, under President Donald Trump, the US declared Antifa a terrorist organization, sparking a nationwide crackdown that blurred the line between security and suppression. The campaign began with Rutgers professor Mark Bray, whose writings on Antifa made him a target of both media and federal surveillance. As violence erupted at ICE facilities, Operation Midway Blitz expanded into a sweeping counterterrorism effort, arresting hundreds of activists, journalists, and academics. Professors like Elias Zepeda were accused of extremism, and universities became battlegrounds for ideological control. ICE and FBI task forces infiltrated campuses, demanding lecture lists and monitoring political speech. Scholars fled the country amid threats and censorship, forming a new silent faculty abroad. By year's end, intellectual exile had replaced open debate, and America's global image as a guardian of liberty faltered. From Washington to Warsaw, critics warned that the United States, once the beacon of free thought, was drifting toward the very authoritarianism it opposed. In the struggle between freedom and fear, one question endures: how much liberty must a nation sacrifice to